Thank you. So I'll just introduce Bhavna briefly, and then we'll hand it off to her to sort of share more about her background and how she got to where she is. So Bhavna, she's the founder and CEO of Caregiver Sati, which is a social venture. Caregiver Sati supports family caregivers and companions for their well-being across a variety of psychosocial needs throughout coaching, counseling, support groups, and training. So I'm sure there's lots of resonant feelings with how we all think about caregivers at Nora. She is a passionate person with lots of interests, and she's had a wealth of experiences before being a Caregiver Sati. I'll just highlight a very interesting tidbit, which I would love to learn more about in another time, but she's a motorcyclist, and she believes in motorcycling, pushing boundaries, both of her body and her mind, and having motorcycling as a vehicle for women to realize their dreams. So we're so excited to have you, Bhavna, and we'll hand it off to you to share more about your background, your experiences, and your journey.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here, and I have to say that I get a cheap thrill out of the fact that, I turn up in a sari for some of these things, and then people say that you're a motorcyclist, and then people wonder, what is this about? And I like the contrast. So thank you for having me. I have to say that I have heard about the excellent path-breaking work that all of you do, and it has been very inspiring. There are so many occasions when I try to explain what Caregiver Sati does, and invariably somebody or the other will turn around and say, have you heard of Noora Health? So another little trivia for you that is not in my my description or my profile is the fact that I like to write, or I indulge in poetry, mostly in Hindustani, and because it is Hindustani, and having a pseudonym is quite the thing. My pseudonym is Noor, and I think we have a very interesting overlap there as well. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a while, and I did totally enjoy putting the topic together. And I am looking forward to your experiences. So I am really hoping that this will be an interactive session that I can learn from you. With that, the theme for today is storytelling and how that is meaningful in the lives of caregivers, people that all of us care about, worry about, and are interested in making the world an easier place for. So the way that I'd like to talk about this is, first off, I'd like to tell you one story that deeply impacted me. How many of you have heard of Dr. Margaret Mead? So Dr. Margaret Mead, and you can quickly Google on the side, is a legendary anthropologist who has done some seminal work. Okay, so there's Dr. Ani here who has heard of her. And she did some seminal work in sexuality across cultures and a variety of other things. Suffice to say that she is a legendary anthropologist. And in one of her seminars, and this particular story is mentioned in a book by Ira Byock, one of the participants asked her a question: what do you think is the sign of a civilization? The first sign of a civilization. And the person who was asking her this was expecting a response in the range of, the sign of first tools, probably organized living, farming, might be the first signs of civilization. And here's what Dr. Mead had to say. She said, to me, the first sign of a civilization is a healed femur bone. The femur bone is the thigh bone. In the animal kingdom, should an animal break the femur bone, there will be sure shot death. But if you were to find a healed femur bone, yes, Anand, thank you. If you were to find a healed femur bone, what would that mean, Anand?
Yeah, like for people able to like stand up and move and help other person who is probably sick.
And why is that the first sign of civilization?
It's like the community bonding, or like probably just coming out of self-obsessed to really taking care of other person, like putting other person in center. Maybe. Yeah.
Correct. And like Varun also pointed out, a healed femur bone is the sign of the fact that someone bothered to take the person who was wounded, tie up the wound, and care for them till they healed. So caring for another being is the very essence of humanity, and it is the first sign of civilization. And we encounter caregivers all the time. And I suppose caring for caregivers is the way that we sustain being alive and being human. I find this story very powerful, and it energizes me almost on a daily basis. There are many such stories, and I am sure each one of you has some stories that have inspired you, that have energized you, and that keep you going, especially on dark days. But the most powerful stories, frankly, are those that we tell ourselves, that define who we are. On a daily basis, we describe ourselves. We talk about ourselves when we introduce ourselves to others. We talk about what happened to us or what motivates us. And in doing any of this, we are not just telling someone else, but we are telling ourselves a story. And for the longest, I used to have a lot of trouble introducing myself. I didn't know what to tell about myself. It used to be a lot easy to say, this is my designation. Luckily, I was in the corporate world for many, many years. So, one could say, I work in this organization. This is my designation. This is what I do. This is where I studied from. So, please look at the feathers in my cap. This is who I am. Yeah. I remember very vividly the day that I had to write a description for myself, as I chose to become a consultant. And in writing a description for myself, one wanted to write about all my accomplishments and my resume. And I was wondering whether my description should speak about the fact that I'm a motorcyclist or not. Does being a motorcyclist have a place in a consultant's resume? Maybe not. And a couple of days just before that, my neighbor in my high-rise building saw me in the lift and said, "Hey, Bhaavana, I saw you on the motorcycle." And I said, "Okay, that's cool." And I said, "But you don't look like a motorcyclist." "Okay, what does a motorcyclist look like?" "You don't have any tattoos and you don't walk like that and you wear saris." Well, talk about stereotypes, right? And I think that incident and a lot of deliberation, I felt that getting back to motorcycling in my late 30s and early 40s has significantly defined who I am. And I really need to tell myself that I am a motorcyclist, and this is what has informed what I do, how I do, and who I am. In fact, it also informs the way that I look at consulting, the way that I look at social ventures, the way that I look at the work with caregivers. And therefore, it is only fair that the story that I tell others about who I am and the story that I tell myself is that of a motorcyclist. And let me tell you something else. So describing myself, like I said, has always been hard until I was in a room like this. And I said, now what all can I talk about myself? What all will be relevant and what all would be interesting? And I decided to say, you know what? I'm Bhaavana, and I'm a restless soul that doesn't like to be put in a box. I don't like a few descriptors of myself. So whatever you will discover about me or know about me that I tell you today might not be relevant, maybe in a couple of days from today. In that program, we were exploring who we are and where we are coming from. And that's when I realized that my great-grandfather was a doctor in Lahore, which is now in Pakistan. So my roots are from undivided Punjab, and my grandparents relocated from what is now Pakistan to Delhi. And this experience has a lot to do with who I am, the kind of woman I am, and the way that I look at not just who I am, but my caregiving journey. Has anyone heard of Dr. Gabor Mate? No? So Dr. Gabor Mate is another interesting person, and I am sure that you would like to look him up after the session. He, again, another person who has deeply impacted who I am and what my life is and how I look at things. He worked in palliative care and was in Vancouver and worked with a lot of people in deep addictions. He personally is a Hungarian who moved to the United States during World War II. The fact that he was born in that time deeply informed him. It led me to think about how my ancestral history may have informed who I am. And one of the things that he says is, don't just ask someone, who are you? Ask someone, what happened to you? So it is at that point that I started saying, I am someone who was born to a family that relocated at the time of partition. And this has deeply informed who I am. It is in discovering stories about my past, my ancestors, that I discovered an exciting fact, which is that my great-grandmother, my family comes from the hills of Pakistan, a very notorious place, Abbottabad. You may have heard of it in some other context. For those of you who don't know, Abbottabad is also the place where Osama bin Laden was found. Yes, exactly. But in those hills, apparently, is where my family comes from. And one of the family legends is that my great-grandmother used to be a horse rider. Yeah. And I can't tell you how much I just feel a sense of connection with her, because in one of the conversations with some of my motorcyclist friends from Pakistan, he mentioned, you know, horse riders of the past are the motorcycle riders of today. And for Anand or Varun, who asked me this question, which is the machine that I ride a Thunderbird 500cc. So at this point, but hopefully I will get another machine soon. So let's see. Coming to caregiving, for the longest, when I looked back and I got back to motorcycling and I looked back at my life and I wanted to do something to honor my father's memory, why did I want to honor my father's memory? So the story is this, that as I was doing my personal growth or my inner discovery, I was asked this question by my mentor and teacher, that what is your dharma, or what is your purpose? And in trying to answer this question, I thought about, okay, the purpose of my life could be driven by the fact that I go back to my ancestral home, my village, take my education and learning experience and make the lives of those who I know better, or who are from my kind better. But all the refugees who came in from Punjab or undivided Punjab are all over the place. They don't have an ancestral home. And like one of you pointed out, it is difficult to say where you're from. We don't have an ancestral home, and I can't do anything for that set of people. So it led me to think about what my life experience has been. As I thought about what my life experience has been, I asked, I needed to answer that question again. What happened to you? And when I answered that question, I realized that the biggest event in my life has been the fact that my father had a terminal illness. He had a rare neurological condition. And I was around 17 or 18 when he was detected with that condition. And over the following 5-6 years, we went through what a family goes through with terminal illness. The fact that my father, a very healthy pilot in the Indian Air Force, suddenly had this unexplained terminal illness, and he was this, son, the ideal son of the family, the person who was holding up a lot of things, just deteriorated in front of our eyes in 5-6 years and was gone by the time I was 25, had a deep impact on who I was. I was the psychological elder son of the family. And therefore, I took on the responsibility of just shouldering the family and making sure that the family was taken care of. And I became the provider, kind of roles that usually elder sons take on. I had the advantage of being from a family that didn't discriminate between boys and girls. So because I was the elder one, it didn't matter whether I was the daughter or the son. I just took on that responsibility. I have a younger brother, but it was my job. And the next many years I spent in trying to build a career, the regular stuff, have a family, make sure the family is together, etc. And it was only in my midlife crisis that I realized I needed to do something for my soul and the purpose of my life. And that's when answering all these questions about what happened to you, who are you, and what is the purpose of your life, is what led me to answer this question that my dharma might be one of the definitions of dharma is also that you can take your personal suffering and make it better for anyone else who might be in the same situation. And for those of you who are familiar with the Mahabharata, that is the difference between what Arjun did and what Karna couldn't do. So Karna was this person who was engrossed in his personal suffering and felt victimized and wanted redemption for himself, whereas Arjun was able to take his personal experience but change it for many others through his actions. And that's a whole other chapter. We can get into the analysis of Mahabharata another time. But suffice to say that this energized and motivated me to think about my life and my purpose and my dharma and be able to look at my life experience. So when I wanted to honor my dad's memory, I thought about my experience And the way that I looked at my experience and described it, I described it as I was the caregiver to the caregiver. My mother was the primary caregiver. And how is it that I can put my academics, my professional experience, my life experience of being a caregiver to the caregiver, that I can change the experience of the family caregiver? So that has been the energy, the motivation, and the background behind Caregiver Sathi, because when I was 17, 18 and a caregiver or a caregiver to the caregiver, I felt that there wasn't an adequate support system for the caregivers. There were too many things that my mother was handling, and she needed not just medical information, but she needed many, many things which were just not there. And I'd like to highlight something else here, that it was very interesting over a period of time when in a conversation with my mother and we were talking about Caregiver Sathi, that she turned around and said, "You keep saying you are the caregiver to the caregiver. Have you ever seen yourself as the caregiver?" And I think in just shifting that perspective, so in looking at my experience as the caregiver to the caregiver, which I think some of you might resonate with, I had a certain view about who I am and what my role is. And the moment I started seeing myself also as the caregiver, not just to my dad, but to my mom, but to my daughter, my brother, it brought in a whole new layer of what happened to me. I was able to explain that I may be suffering from survivor's guilt. I was able to understand that I may have trauma and I may have been a young girl who feels the loss and absence of her father. And it is not just my responsibility and duty to do something for what my mother went through, but to also care for myself. I'm going to take a pause because I see there are too many comments in the chat and I haven't been able to follow them. So can someone help me here, please?
Sure. Maybe they've largely been sort of comments about things resonating. Like Arjun talked about how using the phrase "what happened to you," but rather the question doesn't happen enough in the medical context, healthcare context, if at all. Edith has a potential friend that you could connect with around motorcycles. The resonation around caregiver to the caregiver. And then Shri has asked the question if you could define what caregiving means in your organizational context.
That's a great question, because we are in transition and we are looking at that question every single day. But I have to say that for the longest, and we've been steadfast and stubborn about this, that caregivers to us are the family caregivers, people who are emotionally involved in the lives of the person who needs care, but are not necessarily trained in the act of caregiving. And we are looking at those caregivers, especially those who look after people with life-limiting conditions or incurable conditions. We are not talking about parents who are bringing up children, because the two circumstances are slightly different. When you're a caregiver, when you're bringing up a child, but that caregiving has a range of other things. The kind of support systems, the expectation of future, hope, and various other things are very different than when you are looking after somebody who is actively dying and there is vulnerability and futility and hopelessness, which is very different. So we're talking about the world of the family caregiver who might be grappling with feelings of hopelessness, futility, guilt, shame, anger. And most of this has no legitimate space for expression because we live in societies where, caregiving is put on a pedestal, caregiving is, considered a noble act. And mostly women are caregivers, so they don't really have the opportunity to be able to say that I'm tired of this, or I'm angry with this, or I'm resentful that I can't achieve my dreams, and so on and so forth. Does that definition work?
Shri, do you have any follow-up questions you want to ask?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I think I'm more curious. I'm also curious about this diversity piece that you're talking about. That how on female caregivers this burdens more than the male caregivers. If you have any insights in that, or if you'd like to share any experience from that.
Absolutely. So let's talk about my household. Between my husband and I. When my husband does something for our daughter, he is the coolest dad. He is an unusual man. Yeah. And I ought to be obliged and grateful that I have a husband like him. But when I do something for my daughter, it is something that is expected. Let me tell you about when in 2015, I had given up work. And before that, if I had to travel for work, one could justify it, right? It is work-related travel and one could travel and one went for travel. And although I had a young daughter, my husband and I had an agreement that one of us would be at home and, we will take care because we're a nuclear family and the responsibility is between the two of us. So work-related travel was just justified. In 2015, I had started motorcycle riding and we needed to plan an expedition and 7 of us women were going to the highest motorable road to Mana Pass. And just at the time that I was to go, my father-in-law fell ill with dengue and my husband had to travel to look after him. So first off, there were multiple questions on whether or not I should be traveling instead of my husband, because after all, caregiving is to be done by women more than men. But then when we said that I may actually be interested in going for a motorcycling expedition, which is not work. Not only did, forget anybody else having questions about it, I had serious doubts whether I'm being a good person, whether I'm a good daughter-in-law, a good wife, or a good mother who is choosing to go for her motorcycle ride than looking after the daughter, like being present for my husband or being there for my in-laws. And because our daughter was really young, we had to agree that should something happen, what are we going to do? We said that we will request our friends because I had put my foot down by that time and said, come hell or high water, I am going. And we did make a backup plan and we said that maybe she will sleep over with a friend and we will see. It takes a village to bring up a child, right? So it's okay if I want to go for a motorcycle ride and we will see whatever that there is. I am so grateful nothing happened in that trip, but I have to say in that trip, I was very worried. I could have been anywhere and anything could have happened and I could have not been reachable. And it would have been a very difficult burden, guilt to bear. I do think that that is something that women carry far more than men do. On a daily basis, when a man is looking after his wife or his parents or his children, is seen in a different light, is measured by different yardsticks, and is given appreciation at a different level altogether. I can go on and on, but will this suffice for now?
Yes, yeah, I did understand what you're trying to say. But I think I'll have another follow-up question here. What tensions, conflicts, or challenges, if any, do you feel about your organization work in caregiving in relation to this piece that you have just explained?
So I am a person who thinks fairly gender agnostic. Yeah. So when I never thought of us as a women empowerment organization. I never thought of us as a women dominant organization. I always thought that caregiving is gender agnostic. It is applicable both for men and women. Although a large number of caregivers are usually women, but it's going to change because, in my home, it has changed. So I expect it should have changed elsewhere as well. But I suppose that will be a little slower. But I think the issues are the following. Patriarchy impacts men and women. Many men are great caregivers, but are unable to be caregivers because they have to carry the burden of being the provider in the family. They cannot not be the earning members. And I think that keeps them away from parenting, from caregiving, and from not being the earning members. Women have the luxury of not being that. And I think, that impacts caregivers and caregiving in some very interesting ways. The other thing is that men are able to take a stance that I can get help, I can outsource the work that I'm doing for caregiving. Whereas a large number of women will want to do it themselves, be the hands-on caregiver. I remember as a young mother, I had lots of doubts whether I was a good mother because I was not hands-on enough. I still am not hands-on enough, and I still struggle with it. My daughter is 16, and even as of yesterday, I beat myself up thinking I'm not hands-on enough. Men don't have to do that. Does that address, or do you want me to give you some more questions? So it's, if we were to, okay, so what does this mean? If we were to offer a service, and if we were to say, okay, here's something that you can do for your mental health, or here's something that you can outsource a part of your work, it will be a lot easier for men than it will be for women.
I guess, Bhavna, I'm wondering if the next part, if
Yes.
you can.
So to just connect back to the story and say that I think the story that I told myself, that I have been the caregiver to the caregiver, shifted gears to when I started seeing myself as a caregiver. And I think that impacted a lot of what, how I saw myself and how I was even able to relate with other caregivers. It was in that expedition that in 2015, yes, Rachna, I will just come to that. When we came back from, so that expedition was seminal because we were 7 women going to Mana Pass, which is not something that happens very regularly. Luckily, we were also the first time ever, so we got a Limca record and it became a big thing. And because it was a big thing, Rashmi Bansal, who is a popular bestseller author, wrote a book called Touch the Sky. And in that, she was sourcing some stories about women who are changing their destiny. She wanted to write my story. And to cut a long story short, when she reached out to me and said, I would like to write your story, I felt my story was not good enough to meet the criteria that she might have. And I did tell her that. I was like, I don't think I have had to fight discrimination. I don't think I've had to fight difficulties in my life. I think I've had it fairly easy. And I don't think my story is really worth it. And she said something to me, which I say to a lot of people, myself, saying, every story counts. And you have no idea how many people will value hearing your story, because not everybody wants to have a story of very high difficulties to very significantly different lives. And I do have to say that that was very powerful. I don't know whether my story inspired anybody else or not, but it definitely inspired me to go on doing what I was doing. And with that, I will come to the next point about what is it that we do. When I spoke with a large number of people, two things came up. When you talk to caregivers and you tell them that you ask them, share your story on a public platform. So if you see our YouTube channel or our Facebook channel, you will find a series called Conversations with Gentle Warriors. These Conversations with Gentle Warriors are 30-minute conversations that are hosted by other caregivers. So initially, when we started, I used to host these conversations where we would get caregivers to tell us their story and where they are or what has been. And over a period of time, the design was not to have like a Bhaavana show, but more like conversations with gentle warriors that many people were having. We wanted to normalize caregiving journeys and caregiving stories. When you listen to these, so all those who told their stories became hosts for other new people. Yeah. So there are two levels of things that are happening over there. Now, Conversations with Gentle Warriors was to be able to get people who want to tell their stories. You will find a trend when you analyze those conversations. It is easier for people who have finished their caregiving journey to be able to look back. Those that are actively in caregiving find it very hard to talk their story, number one. Number two, it is easier for caregivers to talk about stories of being victorious, of being brave, of having overcome difficulties, but not of talking about their struggles, their anger, their resentment, their guilt, and their shame. Even for myself, it's not that, I can't talk about my caregiving journey with, it's always, multicolored and has multiple emotions, but you tend to focus on that which presents you in a certain light. It takes a while, and sometimes just telling the story of what happened to you, we would end that conversation and I would call that person, and the person would have a cathartic experience of having told their story. And many would say that some of my friends have logged in, they have heard this, I feel seen. And to bring in another favorite story of mine, how many of you have seen the film Avatar? Yeah? One of the greeting to a new person in that community is to say, I see you. One of the ways that we reach out to another human being and the other person feels healed is if we can see them for who they are. The challenge of caregivers is that because caregiving is invisible and unrecognized and underappreciated or taken for granted, is that people feel not seen. And by asking them, what happened to you or what is your story, you are seeing them. And that per se is a healing act. Today, I'm able to talk about my story in many ways, but I have to say that every time I tell my story, I feel slightly healed. I'm also able to smile at it, talk about it differently, and so on. So the healing process is a spiral journey, and going over your story again and again to be able to see it, to be able to tell it, and to be able to reframe it is the act of healing. The way that we present it is in not just in conversations with gentle warriors. The second format is our podcast series. So we found a large number of people who wanted to tell their stories, but wanted to be anonymous. So what we did was we designed a podcast series in which we take the story of the caregiver, anonymize it, and it's called Caregiver Diaries, and it is read out by another person. So it is like having the experience of going through the caregiver's diary as if you got a peek into their diary. When we write our diaries, we are a little unabashed. We can talk about our emotions. And then the experience of the caregiver comes out very differently. We've had very, very cathartic and very, very moving experiences when people have felt seen, relieved, and heard. I had once an intern who took down 2 stories of her aunts, and she said, my aunt would just not stop crying. She said, nobody has asked me this question ever before. What is my story and what happened to me? So these are the 2 formats that we have. So you will find about 80 odd stories in Gentle Warriors, and many in the podcast, which are anonymized because we do want to respect if somebody doesn't want to tell their story. So it's very interesting. People want the story to be heard, but they don't want to be associated because there is stigma, perhaps. During COVID, we found that doctors, nurses, and people in the healing profession underwent infinite amount of trauma, which I think all of you know. And we had a series of conversations called Humanizing Our Healers. And these are, again, stories of tell us what happened to you. Tell us what your experience was, so that we can see the healers without the wings, without putting them on the pedestal, but like human beings. And the more we see the other person like a human being, full of all kinds of emotions, all experiences, we also give the other person the opportunity to reframe their own experience. Okay, in January, we had our anniversary celebrations, and what we decided to do in that was invite people who had joined us for our conversations with Gentle Warriors and talk to them what it has meant 1 year hence in having told your story on our platform. And each one of them reported being a perceptibly different person, having shared my story and having felt heard and acknowledged on a platform like Caregivers. So if that is, so does that address your question, Rachna?
Yes, it does. Thank you for sharing that, Bhaavana. I have another follow-up question to this, though. How much time do you spend connecting to these people before they share their story? Because as a filmmaker myself and a storyteller, I find it really difficult to break that ice.
Yeah.
Sometimes out in the field, you have language barriers, you have so many other barriers that come in the way because we are not like them. And to get them to trust you and be honest with you, how do you break that ice? Is there anything in particular that you do?
So a large number of people that I have spoken to so far have been through our initial connections, and therefore not much of a challenge. But one of the things that has worked very well, very interestingly, with some of the younger lot and people who might not have too much vocabulary or language, is to get them to draw and talk about in third person. So if you do a little workshop and then you kind of get the person to do a reflective exercise and draw, and then say, what is it that you have drawn? What would you like the world to see that is so far not seen? Yeah. So what happens is one drawing is universal and can happen at any age with any level of literacy. Two, when you make it third person and you're talking about someone else, it's a little easier than talking about yourself. Yeah. And you have the opportunity to do absolutely no problem. Yes, the drawing doesn't have to be good. In fact, you can insist on using your non-dominant hand also. Yeah. So
Go ahead.
yes, I can do a half-day workshop on different methods of workshop, what has been done in workshop. We can certainly do that. We can do many methodologies. I think reflective exercises of some kind are very powerful. Using music, using reflective exercises, using drawing, using movement, physical movement, are all ways of getting expression that sometimes words can be difficult. Not everybody has a facility with words, not everybody has invested in that facility, and not everybody is a storyteller, and therefore sometimes it can be hard. So we have to work with unconscious processes, and music, drawing, movement can help you bring out the unconscious processes.
Bhaavana, I have a quick question for you, if that's okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been very inspiring listening to you. I wanted to ask about the healthcare provider piece that you talked about, just in terms of the perception, of course, of patients and families and so on, in terms of, seeing providers in a different light. But even I wonder, in terms of the experiences you've had in collecting stories from healthcare workers, providers themselves, and their own sort of view of their work, both as, not just as healthcare providers specifically in terms of their role, but as caregivers themselves too. And, how that might relate to, we've talked so much over COVID also about mental health for, healthcare workers and healthcare providers. And I think there's so much more to unravel, of course. And as we work longer term with a large group of nurses, primarily, I think a lot of this is on top of many of our minds at Noora, just in terms of, how can we provide more value to the nurses that we partner with and the other healthcare workers that we partner with.
I'm really grappling for the question. What is your question?
Sorry, I meant in terms of the stories you've collected.
Yeah.
With any specific healthcare providers, how and any learnings you may have seen from that that enlightened this piece.
Yes. So I think fundamentally, the human experience is universal, right? So whether it is a family caregiver or it is just, your friend or family or anyone else, or a person in a profession, the veneer, the personality veneer, or the shield with which we protect ourselves in the world is our accomplishments, our achievements, how we are able to overcome our circumstances, how smart we are, how good we are, how we have been accomplished. So that is always the first layer. It takes a little while to break through to get to the vulnerability of the person and make the connection. My personal experience on this is I don't expect anybody else to show me their vulnerable side. I just have learned to practice showing mine. Different people take different time, depending on their life experiences, to be able to trust you with their vulnerable side. A large number of people, especially people in the medical profession, are used to being seen as experts, and therefore there is a very different power play. And I think it is very important that we recognize that power play, that extra burden of them being experts and having answers to situations, which they may not have. And for them to own up their humanness can take some time. And we just have to be, there's nothing that you can do about it, just be open, in my view. Does that help, Arjun? I think there is a lot that has been spoken about recently, and you may have read it as well, about creating psychologically safe places or psychological safety. And I think it is a skill. It is a skill that people who want to be story collectors certainly need to have, which is, how is it that you can create a psychologically safe space that the other person feels okay to be vulnerable in your presence, that you will not judge them, that you will not advise them, that you will not betray their confidence. You will not tell their story to somebody else without their consent. And if you can provide that confidence, you can get some of the deepest stories, otherwise not.
That was great, Bhaavana. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, so, I wanted to speak about these three broadly things. One is how my story has informed me, etc., who I am and what I do. The second, how I think storytelling and narratives build what is okay or what is not. Look at our mythological stories. Look at stories that are reiterated in common parlance. For example, if I were to ask you to look at my Indian mythology or South Asian mythology, what are the stories of caregivers that you know? Was Ram a caregiver? Shravan Kumar? Do you know these stories? Savitri?
Yeah, I think Shravan Kumar. I heard.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Savitri?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Savitri was the caregiver par excellence. She brought her husband back from the dead.
right.
Okay. And why do you think we have all the films and TV serials that talk about the power of the married woman who can bring back her husband from the dead? And the repeated narrative of that, of a married woman, plays at an unconscious level. Sati Savitri, like someone pointed out, is the ideal married woman. And you think that social narrative would not be at play when a woman is caring for her ill husband? The second thing that I'd like to talk about, and the impact of storytelling on our social narratives, and therefore how we take various roles. You may have heard lots about, so how advertisements show mothers, like Women's Day is coming, let's see this. Women have capes, women do multitasking, they are Durga Matas, and they can be this, that, and the other, and and it is such a trap. All advertisements and all such storytelling, yes, Bhishma Pitama of a different kind, right? In terms of roles and responsibilities. But the stories that we tell about ideal women, ideal mothers, ideal caregivers hang around in our unconscious, in the subliminal collective unconscious of a society, and it impacts how we take roles. Even after education and awareness, despite all kinds of exposure, you will still be influenced by the stories that you have grown up with that convey the social norms of what is good, what is acceptable, what is ideal, what is the best. And it is therefore important to see how these stories govern our lives and therefore form social narratives around caregivers as well. Look at storytelling in popular media. If you see storytelling in popular media, you will see that advertisements and films are the two popular ways in which stories are told on a daily basis. Films or serials. And you will see caregivers and women are presented in a certain light. In fact, one of the other things that we do on our platform is to take films about caregivers and caregiving, and we talk about real caregiving, in which we look at films from the lens of the caregiver. So when you see, so real caregiving is about reviewing films from the lens of the caregiver and saying how that storytelling is impacting us as a collective. Yeah. And we have about 100 films that have been reviewed. You can look them up on our website as well as on Medium. And there is a trend in how stories are told in India and internationally and over a period of time as well. So in the 60s and 70s, you had stories like Main Tulsi Tere Aangan Ki, and now we have Piku, or, you know, in between there's also Guzarish and things like that, that speak about the role of the caregiver in a certain way. Or waiting, or I mean, there are hundreds of films. The second thing, the next thing that I want to talk about is how storytelling in print and pictures influences us. So if you look at books on caregivers and caregiving, recently there have been a large number of books that have been written, but they are mostly from Western authors. And there is a very interesting trend there as well. So you have Kate Washington, and we have once a quarter a conversation with one of the authors that may have written about caregivers or caregiving. They may have spoken about their story. We have one coming up in a week, I think, that's caregiving in print and pictures. The point of having these conversations is to be able to build the lens of the caregiver and be able to shift the social narrative around caregiving. Indian authors tend to, yes, Edith, before you go, let me just tell you, my parents went on a motorcycle ride for their honeymoon. It is quite possible I was conceived on that ride. Please do introduce me to your friend. And I think I should bring this to a close. I think this is the essence of storytelling and why it is significant for caregivers and caregiving.